When a new movie comes out, we have this idea of if you're going to talk about it, you have to say spoiler alert. So if somebody hasn't seen the movie, you don't give away the plot twist or the ending. My question is, how long do you have to wait before you don't have to give a spoiler alert? So a movie came out in 1981. I think you've had plenty of time to see it. It was Superman 2. Now, Superman 1 with Christopher Reeve tracked the story of Superman coming from the planet Krypton and crashed, and like his growing up in Smallville and discovering his powers and moving to the big city. Superman 2 picks up where Superman 1 left off, and actually the whole first part of it is just like the highlights of the first movie. But this is a sequel, so it's the second movie. Now, in the second movie, Superman has been around for a while, and Lois Lane is in love with Superman, and Superman is also fond of Lois Lane. But she doesn't know that Superman is Clark Kent. But in the early part of the movie, she starts to put some clues together. Whenever Superman is around, Clark Kent is not, and as she starts to figure it out, she decides to test him, so she jumps into a river near Niagara Falls, thinking then Clark Kent will become Superman and save her, but he doesn't. Like, he's got some discipline about his secret identity. But then later he falls and his hand goes in a fire, and then nothing happens to it, and so she really figures it out. Now, this leads to Superman taking her to his base, which he created with the green crystal in the first movie, and at the North Pole. And when he's at the base, he figures out that he plugs these into this crystal controller, and he can kind of talk to his parents, even though they're long gone. And he figures out that he can become a human being. But if he becomes a human being, his mom tells him, you lose all of your powers, and you can't go back. Now, if you think about Superman's journey, his home planet is gone. Everyone that's like him is gone. He is alone in the world as the only person with all these superpowers, and people depend on him to do so many other things. And you could see where he's wrestling with his identity to say, why can't I be just like everybody else? And given that opportunity to not just be like everybody else, but to pursue this love that has been shared with him, it's easy to see how Superman says, yeah, I think that's a fair trade. I'm going to die someday, but at least I get to fully participate in this community. Now, while all of that is happening, what Superman didn't know was that there were 3 bad guys from his home planet who got released from their prison in space, and they show up on Earth and start to just wreak havoc. And everybody just keeps telling them someday Superman's going to come, but Superman's not going to come because he's not Superman anymore. And he missed all of this news, and he shows up and finds out what's happening, and he realizes at that point that he had a set of gifts, and he had a purpose, and he had an identity. And when he walked away from that, he walked away from the very things that helped him be a part of this worldly community that he had been a part of. And I think what we get to watch in that movie is Superman is having an identity crisis. When we come to a couple of our Bible stories today, you find the early church having an identity crisis. In the story of Acts, you hear Peter talking after the resurrection to the people of Israel, and he says, you are Israelites. So the first thing he does is ground them in their identity. But he doesn't leave it there. He says, we are the ones who have worshiped the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So he was pointing the people of Israel back to their long history as God's people. And then he says, but you messed up and killed the God of life, the author of life, when Jesus came. You rather would have had a murderer than to accept this person who brought love and grace into the world. And I think what Peter is saying is, you forgot who you were as God's people of welcome and grace and forgiveness and love, and instead you opted for murder and execution. They had an identity crisis, is what Peter seems to be saying. Then we come to the gospel story, and I love this story because it's in the Gospel of Luke. After the resurrection, there's a story of these 2 people walking on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus is with them, and they don't know it's Jesus until he breaks bread. And then they run all the way back, and when they get back together with the rest of the disciples, and they say, hey, Peter just saw Jesus, and they go, hey, so did we, but we didn't recognize him. And while they're talking about that, the text we heard started today says, while they were talking about that, Jesus appears. So you would think that they're like, you saw Jesus, we just saw Jesus, but we didn't recognize him, and then a ghost shows up, you'd think they'd go, oh, there's Jesus. But that's not what happens. They go, oh no, a ghost. And they're terrified, right? They're confused. And it's understandable how they would be confused because they too, I think, are in a space of identity crisis. Each of them had figured out how they were supposed to be in the world at one point. Fisherman, Matthew, tax collector. Jesus shows up and says, actually, I'm going to give you a different identity as a follower of mine. And then they spend a few years following Jesus around, and in that time, develop a new identity. We're no longer fishermen, we're fishers for people. We have learned how to follow Jesus. This is who we are now. We are his disciples. But then he gets killed, and what happens to your identity? That goes away because he's not here anymore. And in the early stage of the resurrection, you don't know what that means yet because that's never happened. So Jesus coming among them, even though he brings them peace and all the rest of that, they're confused. They're trying to figure out who they are. In the Gospel of John, they go back to fishing. And Jesus has to come find them fishing and say, nope, I gave you a whole new thing, remember? But they don't remember. And so when Jesus finds them in this story, they're afraid, they're disbelieving, they're also joyful, like they're in this weird space of trying to figure out what's happening and where they fit in. Now, when we think about Superman having an identity crisis and the church having an identity crisis, I think actually much of life is a journey of us trying to figure out just who we are. Did anybody love middle school? Okay, I didn't think so. And the reason is middle school is terrible. Why is middle school terrible? Well, you've gone from having like one teacher and pretty prescribed learning to now you got to learn more complex stuff and you got to show up in different places and be more responsible for yourself. And while you're supposed to be doing that, your feet keep getting bigger and your body keeps changing shapes and your mind and your hormones are all going crazy and so is everybody else's. It is a hot mess. And what are you supposed to be doing when you're in middle school? Starting to figure out who you are. Like, what gifts do you have? What do you enjoy doing? Where, do you thrive? And where is a struggle? I really appreciated when we lived in Hillsborough County, instead of just picking electives, they made the kids try all the electives for a few weeks for a whole semester so they could not just assume, they could try stuff out and go, you know what, I don't like music. Or, wow, I never knew I loved music. And look at this, I might have an aptitude. So that space of middle school is very much about identity formation. At the end of middle school, do we have it all figured out? No. Then you get to the end of high school, and you're like 17, and people say, what are you going to do now? And the expectation is somehow that you're going to figure that out for the rest of your life. Do some people figure that out for the rest of their life? In terms of what are you going to do? Maybe, but mostly probably not. And you settle on something. So maybe you become an accountant, or you become a teacher, or you become a mechanic, or whatever it is. You're home with your kids as a stay-at-home parent, and then you're going along, and have you got your identity figured out? Kind of, but then something happens. You lose your job, or your body fails on you in some way and you can't do what you used to do, or you live a long, good career and you retire. I have seen many people fail at retirement because they had become so identified with what they did that now that they weren't doing what they did, they didn't quite figure out where they fit in. I've had conversations with people in their 80s who told me they were trying to still figure out what they're going to do when they grow up. Which means our whole journey is one of trying to figure out who we are. Now, through that journey, sometimes we'll land in places that feel good, and sometimes we'll do what Superman did and say, you know what, I just want to be like everybody else. I just want to fit in. And if fitting in means that I'm going to stop doing this thing I love to do, or I'm going to stop talking about this thing I love to talk about, I'm going to do that just so I can blend in and be a part of the whole. Because we as people do want to be part of the whole. Now, Scripture would tell us that we all have gifts, and all of our gifts are necessary to the whole, and we are created to be just who we are. But if we're constantly stirred up trying to figure out who we are, it's hard to live in that space of embracing our own gifts, and sometimes we don't even know what those are, and if we're not sure what our gifts are, how are we going to be fully ourselves? So, back to the movie. Superman gives up all of his gifts and is told that he can't go back, but then realizes he shouldn't have did that. So he goes back to his base in the North Pole, finds the green crystal, gets all of his powers back, right? So, spoiler alert. And then he comes back and saves the world from all of these bad people. But in the process, you find out that it wasn't Superman's superpowers that made him super, because all of the bad guys had the same powers. What made Superman super? He cared. This is what the bad guys figure out is they're like, oh, he cares about these human beings so much, we don't have to attack him, we attack them. And then he'll go to save them, and then he's vulnerable. It's his heart and his care for people that is his real power. And once he connects with that identity and connects that to his journey, he's able to fully live into his gifts. The Bible passages we hear today tell us what our identity is. Now, if our whole journey is one of trying to figure out who we are, that's not going to change, because life happens, circumstances change, we discern something for part of life, and then we have kids, or we get married, or we get divorced. Like, all these things happen, and our journey is constantly moving. But the passage we heard today from 1 John tells us that first and foremost, we are children of God. All of the rest of those things of our identity can shift and change. We can wonder about them. But the author of 1 John says, we are children of God right now. Later on, we're going to be something different, the author says. We don't know what that looks like. But right now, we are children of God. So if you're struggling to figure out where you fit in just now, fair. But underneath all of that, you're a beloved child of God. That never changes. This is what we talk about in the waters of baptism, and why I've been inviting you to remember your baptisms as you bathe and do these things, so that every day you can remember, I am a beloved child of God. Above all else, that is always true. But then, when Jesus is standing with them, he tells them, you remember I told you I was going to die and be raised. He says, you are my witnesses. What is a witness? It's a person who has experienced something and then tells the story. If you just see it, you witnessed it, but witness in this sense means go tell the story. And that's what he tells them to do. You're going to go tell the story. Peter, in the part we heard from Acts, after he tells the people they're having an identity crisis, he says, you know, Jesus was raised. We're the witnesses. I actually, over time, have come to see that I think the witnesses of the resurrection is the primary identity of the church. So if we are all beloved children of God, regardless of where we are and what we're doing in our stages of life, we are children of God, but also, how is that expressed? It's expressed by us being witnesses of the resurrection. Now, on the one hand, that means telling the story of Jesus. Now, do I think we should all just go out and read the story of Jesus on the street corner and shout it at people? Probably not the most helpful way, but there is a space and time for us to share the story of Jesus and to share the story of resurrection. But here's the thing. Superman 2, because it has a 2, means it's what? A sequel. There was a story, and then there was more story. And then there was Superman 3 and 4 and not 5. Then they skipped a bunch of years and got a different Superman and then started over. And I think there's a new Superman coming. What that tells you, though, is there's always more Superman story to tell. And if we are witnesses of the resurrection, yes, we should tell the story of Jesus, but there is also always more new life story to tell, always more resurrection story to tell out of our own experiences of resurrection life. Some of the ways we tell that is by acting it out in love and care and service of our neighbor. So as a congregation, we have gotten a couple of families out of homelessness. We were able to, with our compassion dollars, help them along through some tough times, and they got help from shelters and other places, and now they're no longer homeless. That is us acting out resurrection life so that people can experience something new coming out of the things of struggle and death. But we also tell our stories. We look for resurrection in the world and share when it has happened, whether it's something that we've seen or something that we've experienced. When we were in Tampa, our congregation participated in the homeless count. And if you had asked me before we did that how many homeless people we had in the community around us, I would have told you 3. Because as I drove around, there were 3 guys that slept underneath the rental trucks in a little strip mall. Well, then we went and looked for homeless people. And we stopped into a little gas station and said, do you ever encounter people that are homeless around here? And they said, oh, yeah, they come here to eat. And the guy who owns the auto parts store next door gives us money to feed them. We were like, really? Well, that's interesting. And they helped us find some of those people and have a conversation with them. Then we went up by where the 3 people we knew where they were, and there was a little clinic there. And we went into the clinic and said, what kind of encounters do you have with the homeless people? And they said, well, anytime a drug or manufacturing rep comes and brings us all the food they bring us, we feed them outside. Really? Now, were those 2 places solving homelessness for the world? No. Were they bringing grace and something new into places that were places of struggle and despair? Yes. That's resurrection life. That is what we witness. We see it. We talk about it, right? We tell the story. And hopefully, you've all had experiences where something of grief, something of loss, something terrible has happened, and somehow something new has come out of that, because that's what God does. You may not think of that as the story of Jesus. You may not think of that as resurrection, but that's exactly what it is. And if our identity, whatever we're struggling with as to who we might be, is grounded as being beloved children of God who are witnesses of the resurrection, what we are then encouraged to do is to believe and trust that Jesus is in fact still working, that we are the sequel to the story, and that it keeps being told. Not because we're the authors of it, right? Peter calls Jesus the author of life. So the author of life continues to write life into the world. What we get to do is look for it and tell the stories when we see it so that other people might be able to see it as well. Amen.